My name is Elias Cord Vanthorpe, and I am giving this statement under oath to the Wexford County Circuit Court in the matter of the death of Raymond Allen Pelletier, occurring on or about the 14th of February, 1937, in the hardwood country north of the Manton Road terminus, Township Range 7, Wexford County, Michigan. Before the examiner reads any of that back to me, I want to say one thing for the record, and I want it written down exactly as I say it. The prints in the snow around that cabin were not made by a bear. They were not made by a wolf. They were not made by any animal I have seen in 30 years of working timber and trapline in the northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula both, and I have seen all of them. Whatever made those prints was running on 2 legs. It stood somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall by the evidence of where its breath fogged the chinking between the wall logs, and on the night of the 13th to 14th of February, it put its hands, or whatever serves it for hands, through 4 inches of solid pine wall plank, as though the wood were a thing it had already decided would not stop it. Raymond Pelletier went back for the horses. That is what I have to live with. He went back for the horses because I would not leave them, and because we spent 4 hours arguing about whether to go, and he is in the ground at St. Michael's in Cadillac, and I am sitting in this room talking to a court reporter about a thing that no one in this building is going to believe I saw. I am 53 years old. I have been trapping the Michigan North Country since 1907, first with my father out of Roscommon, then on my own line out of Manton. I have spent more winters alone in the back country than most men spend indoors, and I am not given to imagination. My first wife will tell you that. My second wife will tell you that without being asked. I will tell you what happened from the beginning, as clearly as I can remember it, though I want the examiner to know that certain parts of this account are difficult to put in order, because there were stretches of those nights during which I was not entirely in possession of my reason, and I am not ashamed to say so. The sounds alone were enough for that. Raymond and I arrived at the base camp on the 7th of February, 1937. We had been running a winter line out of that camp for 4 seasons, the same territory, the same cabin, same trail network. The camp sat at the end of a 2-track that went north off the Manton Road about 11 miles, then another 1.5 miles through second-growth hardwood, before opening into a small clearing on the south face of a low ridge. The cabin itself was a trapping camp structure, nothing elaborate, built from pine logs in the early 20s by a man named August Kroll who sold us the lease in 1933. The walls were 12-inch pine logs, with moss and river clay chinking, a stone fireplace on the north wall, 1 window on the east, no window on the south, a heavy plank door facing west. The south wall, which is the wall I will be describing later, was solid construction. August Kroll had built it to hold through Michigan winters, and for 14 years it had done exactly that. We brought 2 horses in, a bay gelding named Foster, who was Raymond's, and my own mare, an Appaloosa I called Sedge, short for Sedgwick, because she was stubborn the same way the old surveyor I used to run line for was stubborn. Both animals were useful in the North Country because they were cold weather conditioned, meaning they did not spook at ordinary woods noises, the way a barn-raised horse does. That detail matters. I will come back to it. We had 12 days of food, 2 weeks of trapping hardware, and the full cache set up. A pole cache about 40 yards north of the cabin, 8 feet off the ground, used for storing pelts and dressed meat away from predators. We put up the cache the morning we arrived, staked the perimeter, and settled in. The weather when we got there was overcast, temperature around 10 above Fahrenheit, which is normal for early February in that part of Wexford County. Snow was packed hard from the previous week's freeze, probably 8 inches of settled base, and the ground under that was frozen to a depth that made any track pressed into the snow's surface unusually well preserved. I noticed the prints on the morning of the 9th. Raymond was still asleep when I went out to check the firewood rack on the east side of the cabin. I had been out since first light running the nearest section of the trap line, a loop of maybe 4 miles through the hardwood drainage north of the ridge. I had come in with 3 mink and a beaver, not a spectacular morning but a fair one, and I was in a reasonable frame of mind when I walked around the east corner of the cabin and saw what I saw at the base of the cache poles. The perimeter stakes we put up around the base of the cache were white birch stakes, sharpened and driven in a 6-foot circle, the idea being that any animal scrabbling at the base of the poles would snag the stakes and think better of trying to climb. Wolves will try the poles if they smell blood, and we had dressed venison up there. The stakes were scattered, not knocked aside the way a bear throws them, where the mark in the snow shows the animal swiped sideways. They had been pulled. 3 of them were lying outward in the snow with their points up, meaning something had gripped each one at the base and drawn it straight out of the frozen ground. I crouched and looked at those stake holes, and I could see the finger marks in the compressed snow around each one. Not paw marks, something that had closed around the stake and pulled. I told myself a man had come through the camp in the night. A trapper from another line, maybe, helping himself to a look at our cache. I was not comfortable with that explanation, but it was the most bearable one available, and I was not yet committed to the other possibilities. Then I walked the perimeter of the cache poles, and I found the loop, a single unbroken circuit, pressed into the snow and into the frozen earth beneath it, at 4 inches depth in places. 2-point track, bipedal stride. The front part of the foot was broad, with 5 toe impressions, and the toe impressions had depth at the front of each one that told me there were points there, not flat human toes, points that had dug in. The stride length was approximately 52 inches from heel print to heel print, which I measured by lying my arm along the distance, because my arm from shoulder to fingertip is 48 inches, and I could see the stride was longer. Whatever had made this track was large, and it had walked around the base of our cache in a complete circuit, once, with no deviation, before moving back toward the tree line to the north. I stood there for a while and looked at those tracks. I want to say something about what it is like to be a man who has spent 30 years in the North Woods reading track and come to a set of prints that do not resolve into anything you have a name for. There is a particular quality to that experience that I do not have words for in normal speech. It is not simply puzzlement. It is a kind of narrowing, like the world is getting smaller around you, while the thing in front of you gets larger, even though it is only a mark in the snow. You think, I know what made everything out here. I know what walked here and what flew here and what crawled here. And then you look at what is in front of you and you think, I do not know what made this. And the second thought comes fast behind the first. If I do not know what made this, then I do not know what else I do not know about what is out here with me. I went in and woke Raymond. Raymond Allen Pelletier was 29 years old in February of 1937. I had been running line with him for 2 seasons. He was from Traverse City originally, had come to the trade late, meaning he had done a few other things first, including 2 years studying at the Michigan College of Mining and Technology in Houghton before his money ran out, and he came north to the woods because the woods were hiring and everything else was not, this being the Depression still, and the fur market being one of the few things still generating any cash. He was intelligent, Raymond, more book-schooled than me, though I would not say more woods-schooled. He was a fair trapper, a reliable camp partner, and he had the useful quality of being calm when things went wrong in ordinary ways. He was also the kind of man who, when presented with something that did not fit his model of the world, worked very hard to make it fit, rather than admit it might not. He came out and looked at the tracks with me, and he said they were bare. I told him there was no bear track that printed like that. He said the cold had done something to the surface of the snow, made one track look like 2. I told him to look at the stride length, and he said a large bear on uneven footing could step that wide. I did not argue long. I was 48 years old in 1937, and in 30 years of woods work I had learned that there are 2 kinds of moments when you are in the North Country. Moments when argument is useful, and moments when the only thing useful is to pay close attention and stay ready. This was the second kind. Raymond could call it a bear if that helped him. I was going to watch. We spent that day running the east section of the line, came back to camp around 4 in the afternoon. The light goes fast in February in northern Michigan, particularly under overcast, and by 4:30 it was full dark. We cooked on the fireplace, dried some things out, settled in. I will say that the evening was unremarkable until perhaps 9 o'clock, at which point I became aware of a sound from the north. Here is the thing about sound in the North Woods in February, and why what I heard that first night was different from ordinary woods noise. February in the Michigan hardwoods is among the quietest environments in the natural world. The songbirds are gone south. The insects are nothing. The squirrels and smaller rodents are largely dormant in deep cold. The larger animals, the deer, the elk in places, the coyotes, the wolves where they still ran, are moving but quietly, conserving heat, not burning calories on noise. What sound there is at night in that country in that season is sparse and specific. The creek ice settling, the occasional branch crack under snow load, wind through the high timber, and the voices of the animals that are still active, coyote mostly, and owl. You learn to know those sounds the same way you know your own heartbeat. They are the background. They do not alarm you. What I heard that night at 9 o'clock was not from that background. It was a rhythmic sound. That is the first thing I can say about it with confidence. It had cadence, repetition, a pulse. It came from the north, from the direction of the ridge above the tree line, and it came at intervals of roughly 2 seconds. A sound, a pause, a sound, a pause, that carried through the cabin walls without difficulty because our cabin was not a sound-sealed structure and never meant to be. It was a wet sound. That is the second thing. It had the quality of something breathing through moisture, the way a dog that has been running hard will breathe, with that open-mouth heaviness where you can hear the saliva in it. But it was low, not the high panting of an excited animal. A deep, controlled, rhythmic exhalation, each breath with a weight behind it that suggested a large chest. I sat up in my bunk and listened. It continued for perhaps 20 minutes from the tree line, consistent distance, consistent rhythm, and then it stopped, not gradually. Clean stop, as though a switch had been thrown. I lay back down. I did not sleep easily, but I did eventually sleep. In the morning I told Raymond what I had heard. He told me it was a coyote carrying a kill, because a coyote will breathe heavily through a mouthful of prey, and the sound carries oddly at night through cold air. I told him I had heard coyotes carrying kills many times, and this was not that. He told me I was probably half asleep when I heard it, and my mind had made it stranger than it was. I did not argue. I want the examiner to note that on the morning of the 10th, before we left camp, I found additional tracks. These were not in the same location as the previous night's circuit. These were on the south side of the cabin, along the wall. I found 3 prints in the snow along the foundation, each one pressed as deep as those around the cache, the same bipedal stride, moving west to east. The longest of those prints measured 17 inches from heel to the furthest toe impression. I did not bring a ruler. I measured against my boot, which is a size 11, and my boot fit inside that print with 2 full inches of clearance on both sides. I did not tell Raymond about those prints immediately. I am not certain why. I think I knew that if I told him, we would have the argument we needed to have a day earlier than we were prepared to have it, and I was not yet willing to leave. We had 6 days of sets out. The catch to that point was worth something, and the debt we owed on the equipment and the lease was not a small number. I told myself one more look at the situation before I decided anything. I have told myself since that it was a bad decision. I have told myself since that every decision I made that delayed our departure cost us time we could not afford, and I stand by that assessment. But I want the record to show that the decision was motivated by economics and stubbornness, not by ignorance. I knew something was wrong. I chose to stay anyway. That is the part I carry. We ran the west section of the line on the 10th. The day was unremarkable except for the horses. Both Foster and Sedge were picketed on the east side of the cabin, in a lean-to we had extended from the east wall for exactly that purpose. Adequate shelter for the temperature, hay on the ground, water bucket that we broke ice on twice a day. The animals were accustomed to the camp from 3 previous seasons. They were steady animals, as I said. When we came back from the west line at around 3 in the afternoon, both horses were against the east wall of the lean-to, pressed into the corner. Sedge was shaking, which I had never seen her do in any weather or any circumstance in 7 years of owning her. Foster had his ears pinned flat and was showing his eyes in a way that meant he was very close to fighting the picket rope. I stood in the lean-to entrance for a moment and looked at them and felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I went around the cabin perimeter. The snow along the south wall had been disturbed. I could see where something had stood close to the foundation, because there was a depression there that was not a footprint exactly, more like the compression you get when weight has been applied from above for a sustained period. The snow was packed in a rough oval at the base of the south wall, and above it, at a height of approximately 7 feet, I could see where the chinking between 2 of the pine log courses had been partially displaced. From the inside, or possibly from the outside. I could not determine the direction. I pressed my finger into the gap and felt cold air, so the seal was broken, but it had been a fair seal when we arrived. I went inside and looked at the interior face of that section of wall. There was nothing obvious from inside. The chinking was in place on the interior face. Whatever had applied pressure to that section had not been enough to push through from outside, or it had been probing from inside out. Either interpretation alarmed me. Raymond came in from unpacking the horses, and I told him everything. The prints along the south wall, the foundation compression, the chinking, the horses' behavior. I told him about the prints I had found that morning and had not mentioned. I told him what I thought, which was that something was circling our camp at night and investigating our structure during the day while we were away. I told him I wanted to leave. Raymond listened to all of it. He sat across the fire from me and he thought for a moment, and then he told me what the catch was worth and what we owed against it. He ran the numbers in a way that was accurate, because Raymond was good with numbers. He said we had 4 more days of good trapping if the weather held, and at the current catch rate, we would come close to breaking even on the season, and if we left now, we would be 3 seasons in the hole on the lease and the equipment note. And he asked me what I thought we should do about that. I did not have a clean answer. The money was real. The debt was real. The threat was something I could describe but not name. We stayed. That night, the 10th to 11th of February, I sat up in the bunk with the rifle across my knees and did not sleep. The fireplace was banked but not out. The cabin was maybe 45 degrees at the high end, colder toward the floor. Raymond slept. He had the easier conscience in that moment, having agreed with himself that the tracks were bare and the horses were spooked by coyote scent, and the whole situation was something a practical man from the northern Lower Peninsula could wait out. I did not share his comfort. I sat with the rifle and I listened. At approximately 11:30, the huffing started. Not from the tree line this time. I want the examiner to understand the difference in what I mean. The previous night, the first night, the sound had originated from the north, from the tree line at the ridge, which was roughly 100 yards from the cabin. On this second night, the sound was at the east wall of the cabin within the first 5 minutes. It had not built up gradually in the way a sound does when its source is approaching. It was simply there, close, as though whatever made it had crossed the 100 yards of open clearing between the tree line and the cabin in less time than it took me to register that I was hearing it. The rhythm was the same, 2-second intervals. The same wet, heavy quality, each breath with that running dog weight, that quality of effort and heat combined. But now it was 10 feet away at most, separated from me by 12-inch pine logs and whatever air gap existed in the chinking. I did not move. I want to be accurate about what my body did. I pulled my feet up from the edge of the bunk. I set my back against the wall, and I held the rifle across my chest, both hands, and I breathed as quietly as I could manage. The sound moved. That is what I want to communicate. It moved along the wall. East wall, southeast corner, south wall. It was not stationary. It was moving laterally at a pace I can only describe as deliberate, not fast, something taking its time, and it stayed at the same height throughout, which meant if I imagined its source on the outside of the wall, the source of the breathing was consistent with something standing upright at a height of approximately 8 to 8.5 feet. A standing bear, I told myself. A bear standing on its rear legs and pressing its nose to the chinking. I did not believe this explanation. I held it in my mind anyway, because it was the only container I had for what I was hearing. The sound continued for approximately 40 minutes, moving in a slow patrol along the south wall, doubling back, moving again. Then it stopped. Same clean cessation as the first night. No fading, no departure sound, no retreat through snow. I waited another hour before I moved. Then I went to the east window, which I had cleared of ice sheathing the previous day, and I looked out into the clearing. The clearing was empty. The moonlight was good, partial clouds, and I could see the cache poles and the lean-to, and the full extent of the open ground between the cabin and the tree line. Nothing was there. Nothing moved. I looked at the snow immediately outside the east window. In the moonlight, with the contrast clear, I could see the depression track in the snow along the cabin base, moving west. I could not see where it ended. I went back to bed. I did not wake Raymond. On the morning of the 11th, I found something else, and this is the item I brought to the county seat, and I understand it is here in this proceeding as an exhibit, the section of wall plank the examiner's office retrieved from my truck when I arrived. Along the south wall, at a height of roughly 5 feet from the ground, I found a section of the exterior log face that had been scored. 5 parallel marks, running slightly diagonally downward from left to right, each mark driven approximately a 1/4 inch into the exterior face of a 12-inch pine log, not scratched, not abraded the way a bark rub looks. These were cutting marks, the same shape and spacing as the marks on the piece of plank I carried out, though these exterior marks were shallower. The exterior log was harder, older wood, more compressed. The plank I carried out came from the south wall interior, and I will tell you about that plank shortly. But these exterior scoring marks were the first instance I saw of what the thing used to make those marks. And what I can say about them is this: 5 points, parallel, spaced at roughly 1.5 inches between each mark, and they were not symmetrically arranged the way a machine cut would be. They had the irregularity of something organic, meaning the outer marks were slightly wider spaced than the inner ones, and the marks were not all the same depth, the center marks being slightly deeper, which is consistent with how a gripping hand generates more force at the middle of its reach than at the outside. I will let the examiner draw his own conclusions about that. I told Raymond. I showed him the marks. He stood and looked at them for a long time. When he turned around, his expression had changed from the previous 2 days. He did not immediately offer an alternative explanation. He said we should keep our fire going inside, keep the light up at night, and we should be out within 48 hours, regardless of what we had in the sets. He said he still thought it was some kind of animal, a large bear or something unusual, and he did not want to surrender a full season's work to a bear that was most likely curious about the food cache and had no interest in the cabin itself, and that the fire and the light and our presence would be enough to discourage further investigation. I told him I did not want to wait another 48 hours. I told him I wanted to pack the horses that day and go. I said the catch we had was enough to reduce the debt meaningfully, if not entirely, and that the catch we had was less important to me than the 2 of us leaving that clearing intact. Raymond said, "We don't run from bears, Elias." That is what he said. I have thought about it many times since. He meant something sensible by it. He meant that 2 experienced woodsmen do not let a curious animal drive them off a season's work. In ordinary circumstances, he would have been correct. These were not ordinary circumstances, and I think by then he knew that, but he had arranged his understanding of the situation around the word bear, and he was not ready to dismantle that arrangement. We compromised. We would run 1 more full day of trap checks, collect what we had in the sets, and leave on the morning of the 13th. Not the 48 hours Raymond had suggested, but a shortening of it. 1 more day of work, One more night in the cabin, then out before dawn on the 13th, regardless of what was still in the sets or in the cache. I agreed. I have looked at that agreement from every angle available to a man who has had 6 years to think about it, and I still cannot tell you with certainty that I was wrong to agree. Another 24 hours, I told myself, and we would be out. We had managed 2 nights. We would manage a third. The 11th to 12th was the worst night yet, and I want the record to be precise about this, because the examiner is going to hear from the conservation officer and the deputies who came to the site, and I want my account to be consistent with what they found. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the huffing began. Not from the tree line, not from the clearing, from directly outside the south wall. There was no approach that I could detect. I had been listening since sundown, straining for the sound of something crossing the clearing, the sound of footsteps in the packed snow. I heard nothing until the sound was already at the wall, and then it was there, full volume, the 2-second rhythm, the wet rolling exhalation, the quality of a large animal that is working its lungs deliberately, like something that has been running and has decided to be still but cannot quite slow its breathing. I was awake. Raymond was asleep, and I woke him by putting my hand on his shoulder and pressing down hard enough to communicate that whatever I was waking him for was not a small matter. He sat up, and I pointed at the south wall, and we both listened. His face changed. I watched it in the firelight. Raymond had a long face, angular, with a jaw that was always set firm whether he was eating or resting or working. When he heard the sound through the south wall, his jaw dropped open slightly. Not in a theatrical way, in the involuntary way of a man whose body is responding before his mind has finished deciding what to do. We sat there in the firelight and listened to it move. Same lateral patrol as the previous night, but slower. And I want to be precise. On the second night, it had taken roughly 40 minutes to complete one slow circuit of the south wall section. On this third night, the 11th to 12th, it completed what I estimate was 2 full circuits of the entire cabin exterior. South wall, west wall past the door, north wall, east wall past the window, and back again, and each circuit took it roughly 30 minutes, meaning we sat with that sound circling us for about an hour and a half. The horses were making noise in the lean-to, both of them. I could hear Foster's hooves on the frozen ground, a rapid, anxious stamping, and at one point Sedge made a sound I had not heard from her before, not quite a scream, closer to a groan with force behind it, the sound of a large animal that is terrified and cannot determine which direction to flee. Raymond had the rifle. I had the large skinning knife I kept on my belt and a hatchet from the tool wall. We did not discuss what we would do if the sound came through the door. We both understood that our door was a solid pine plank door, double hung, with an iron drawbar dropped into iron brackets, and that this was our best protection, and it would be adequate or it would not, and there was nothing further to do about it. When the sound stopped that night, it was closer to 2 in the morning. I know this because Raymond had a watch. We sat awake until dawn, did not speak much, and with the first light we began packing. That morning, the 12th, I walked the exterior of the cabin in the snow and measured what I could measure. The track circuit was there, compressed into the snow around all 4 walls, a continuous loop with no gap, no point of departure that I could see, which I still cannot entirely account for. The tracks on the south wall showed the deepest impressions, consistent with more time spent there, more weight applied in a slower movement. I found a section of the south wall exterior, where the chinking between the second and third log courses from the bottom had been entirely cleaned out. The river clay and moss fill, maybe 4 inches of it, had been removed and lay in a small pile in the snow at the base of the wall. Whatever had been outside our wall the previous nights had been working on the chinking with some care. From outside looking in through that gap, I could see the interior firelight. It had opened a window into our cabin. I stood there in the cold February morning, and I understood that. Raymond and I worked fast. We packed the usable portion of the catch into the sled, broke down the camp hardware that could be gotten out quickly, and prepared both horses to travel. My plan was simple. We would be moving south on the 2-track before noon, and we would not look back. Raymond was in agreement. Whatever argument remained in him about waiting out the bear had been dissolved by a night of listening to it walk around his shelter. We were close. We were very nearly out. And then the sled packed wrong. The pelts were wrapped in canvas, and the canvas had frozen slightly at the corners, and they did not lay flat in the sled bed, which meant the weight distributed unevenly, and with an unevenly loaded sled, you risk losing the load on the 2-track ruts, which in February in that country could mean losing your entire catch in a ditch. Raymond said he could repack it in 20 minutes if he had the time, and he asked me to hold the horses at the head of the 2-track while he did it. I went to the head of the 2-track with both horses, which is about 60 yards from the cabin. I stood there, and I held their leads, and I watched the tree line, and I counted the minutes. The horses were calm on the move, the way horses often are when the movement is forward and away from what frightened them. I counted 20 minutes, and Raymond was not yet at the 2-track head. I called back to him. He called back that he was close. I counted another 10 minutes. The sky had gone gray in the way it does before a weather change, and the temperature had dropped several degrees from the morning low. I was cold, standing still, and the horses were feeling it. I called again. Raymond did not answer the second time. I want to be precise here, because I know what a court is going to do with what I say next. I stood at the head of that 2-track for approximately 5 additional minutes after the second call went unanswered. During that time, I was making a calculation that a fair man might describe as a terrible one, and a fair man would not be wrong. I had both horses. Raymond knew where the 2-track was. The track south was 11 miles to the Manton Road, and no turnoffs, nothing to get confused about. I told myself Raymond had fallen, or was having trouble with the sled, and would be at the 2-track head within another 10 minutes, and that when he arrived we would go together. I waited those 10 minutes. Raymond did not come. At that point I made the decision that I have turned over in my mind every single night since February of 1937. I started down the 2-track. I told myself I would reach the first clear area where the track widened at about mile 3, where there was room to turn the sled, and I would wait there. If Raymond did not arrive within a reasonable time, I would go to the Manton Road, leave the horses, and catch with the German family who farmed the south end of the 2-track in exchange for services, and go for the county sheriff. I drove those horses down that track in about 40 minutes. The German family, Heinrich Braun and his wife Martha, took the horses without asking questions about why I was alone, because people in that part of the country in those years had the quality of not asking questions that might bring them into something they had no part in. Heinrich Braun drove me to the Manton Town Exchange in his truck, and I called the Wexford County Sheriff's Office from the telephone there. I told them Raymond Pelletier was at the camp, and I had lost contact with him. I told them there was a dangerous animal in the area, and I needed a deputy to accompany me back in. I did not tell the officer on the telephone everything I knew, because the officer on the telephone had the voice of a man who would come out with exactly the amount of urgency appropriate to a confused trapper calling in a possible bear sighting, and that was not the urgency I needed. The deputies did not get to the camp until the 14th. 4 days. That is what the roads and the weather and the schedules of the Wexford County Sheriff's Department provided. A conservation officer named Gordon Stotts came with them. I was not there when they found Raymond. They would not let me go to the site, because the 2-track was soft, from a partial thaw, and they said additional vehicles would compromise it, which was a practical reason, and possibly also the deputies using their judgment about whether a witness should be at the recovery site before they could record it properly. What Gordon Stotts told me, and what is in his field notes, which I understand are part of this proceedings record, is this. Raymond Pelletier was found approximately 300 yards east of the cabin, in the snow at the base of a stand of second-growth beech trees. He was on his back. He was fully clothed, his coat buttoned, his boots laced, which meant he had not been stripped of warmth by the cold in the way a man who dies of exposure would show, where they shed their clothing in the final confused stages. He showed no injuries that Gordon Staats could identify, no wounds, no bruising that Staats noted, no evidence of animal attack. The county coroner's report, which the examiner has in front of him and which I have read, uses the phrase consistent with cardiac arrest caused by acute exertion or extreme shock, and then in the next line notes that there is no adequate clinical basis for either conclusion given the subject's age and reported health. Raymond Pelletier was 29 years old and had the constitution of a man who spent his winters running trapline. He did not have a heart condition. He did not have a history of fainting or any cardiac complaint. What Gordon Staats also told me, and what I want this court to record clearly, is that Raymond's face, his expression when they found him, was described by Staats as one of complete recognition, not terror in the abstract, not the blank look of a man who simply dropped. Staats, who had been a conservation officer in the northern Lower Peninsula for 14 years and who had recovered bodies from the woods on other occasions, said he had never seen an expression quite like it, and that the closest thing he could describe it as was the look a man gets when he sees something he expected to see and hoped very much not to, as though Raymond had turned and looked at what was behind him. I want to talk about the cabin now, and about the wall, and about the plank that is in evidence in this proceeding, because I need this court to understand what happened in that structure between the time I left with the horses and the time Raymond was found 300 yards east in the snow. The deputies and Gordon Staats entered the cabin on the 14th and found it in the following condition. The south wall had been breached, not the door. The south wall itself, the solid log construction built by August Kroll in the early 20s, built to hold through Michigan winters, had been opened. The second and third log courses from the bottom of the south wall showed a section of approximately 4 feet in width, where the logs had been pushed inward, not broken out, pushed. The interior faces of those logs showed where the pressure had come from the exterior, because the fibers of the pine were compressed and fractured in a pattern consistent with external force. The logs themselves had not been cut or sawed. They had been driven inward under sustained load, the way a wall fails when something presses against it that exceeds its capacity to resist. The south interior face of the second log course showed 5 parallel gouges. These are what became the plank section I pried free with a draw knife and a splitting wedge and hauled to the county seat in the bed of my truck on the morning I made this deposition. The examiner has examined this piece, and I will describe it for the record. The 5 marks run roughly horizontal across the interior face, each approximately 4 inches in depth through the full thickness of the plank face, driven clean through 4 inches of pine wood, spaced at the same 1.5-inch interval I observed in the exterior scoring on the 11th. The marks are not uniform. The center mark is slightly deeper than the outer marks. The outer marks angle very slightly outward, which is consistent with the spread of the outer elements of something gripping or striking with a broad hand. These marks go through the wood. Through it, the coroner examined the piece at my request before this deposition and confirmed that the marks are not consistent with any standard hand tool, axe, adze, or saw blade. He wrote that in a note which he declined to attach to his official record. He declined to attach it. I will move to what I know and what I do not know, because I am under oath, and under oath is a condition I take seriously. I do not know for certain what made the tracks around that cabin. I do not know for certain what was outside the south wall on the nights of the 9th through the 13th of February, 1937. I did not see it clearly. On the night of the 10th to 11th, when the circuit of the exterior was closest and most sustained, I was inside the cabin, and I did not look out the window. I will tell you why. The east window of that cabin was approximately 14 inches wide and 30 inches tall, a small opening with a hinged shutter on the interior. On the night of the 11th, when the sound was at closest approach, I considered opening the shutter and looking out. I considered it, and I decided against it, and my reason was this. If whatever was circling us was as large as the evidence suggested, then a 14-inch window was not protection from it, and if I opened that shutter and looked out and it was directly outside the glass, then we would be looking at each other through a very small opening, and I did not know what it would do next. That was a fear-driven decision. I am not proud of it, and I am not apologizing for it. It is what I chose. What I did see, I will describe as carefully as I can. On the morning of the 12th, as I have stated, I saw the tracks around the exterior. 2-point track, bipedal stride, 17-inch foot length with 5-point pressure at the toes. I saw the scored exterior logs. I saw the cleared chinking section. On the morning of the 13th, before we loaded the horses, I walked the south wall in the early light, and I saw the exterior face of the logs in the breech section, and I could see that the second course from the bottom had been subjected to pressure at some point during the night of the 12th to 13th, because the outer face showed compression stress fractures in the wood grain at the breech point that were not present on the 12th morning. Something had applied force to that wall on the night of the 12th to 13th, and had bent the wood but had not yet driven through. It completed the job after I left. I have a theory about why it did not breach the wall while we were both inside, and I offer it only as a theory, not as a certainty. I think it was listening to us. I think the sound we heard each night was not, or not only, respiration. I think the rhythm and the pacing and the sustained presence along the wall was something deliberate and investigative. And I think whatever was outside that wall in those nights had enough intelligence or instinct to understand that two men with a fire and a rifle inside a structure were a different proposition from the same structure with no fire and no occupants. I think it waited until I left with the horses. I think it knew I had left. And I think Raymond was still inside when it came through. This is where I need the examiner to understand something, and I ask that it go into the record plainly. Raymond went back inside to repack the sled. He was in that cabin, alone, on the morning of the 13th. Within an hour of the time I calculate the wall was breached, based on the state of the wood when the deputies and Gordon Stotts arrived on the 14th. The breach is a morning breach, Stotts told me, based on the degree of frost adhesion on the exposed log faces, which would have formed within hours of the breach occurring in cold of that temperature. A morning breach, not a night breach. Raymond had time to run. He ran east, into the beach stand, 300 yards in the snow with his coat buttoned, and whatever came through the south wall went after him. And it found him, or he saw it finding him, and his heart stopped. The examiner is going to ask me, and the county attorney is going to ask me, what I believe it was. I am going to answer that question because I am under oath, and I believe in giving honest answers to direct questions, and the honest answer is this. I believe it was what the Odawa and the Ojibwe communities of the northern Lower Peninsula have been describing for as long as there have been communities here, and what the older men at the Manton feed store, the ones who had been logging these ridges since before the First War, called by a name that I heard in fragments over 3 decades of working the northern Michigan woods and never paid serious attention to until February of 1937. I believe it was the thing they called the Dogman. I believe it is a creature that exists in the hardwood country of northern Michigan, that holds territory the way a wolf holds territory, and that does not welcome trespassers on that territory with the kind of tolerance that allows them to simply continue about their business. I believe Raymond and I set up our line camp in the middle of its ground, and I believe we ran it through its ground for 4 seasons without incident, because 4 seasons of any one winter's activity is not necessarily enough to constitute a provocation. And I believe that in February of 1937, for a reason I cannot name with certainty, we crossed some threshold of tolerance that the previous 3 seasons had not crossed, and it decided we were a problem to be solved. I do not know if the threshold was the location of the cache, or the extent of our trap line that year, or something about the timing of our arrival. I have thought about all of these possibilities. I have thought about whether the cold that winter, which was unusually sustained and deep even by northern Michigan standards, had something to do with it, whether the cold had pushed it down from higher country, and we were in the path of that pressure. I do not know. I know what happened. Now I am going to tell the examiner something that is not in any of the field notes or the conservation officer's report, and I am going to tell it because I believe it is relevant to what killed Raymond Pelletier, and because the coroner declined to put it in his record. When I was at the head of the 2-track with the horses on the morning of the 13th, waiting for Raymond, before I heard the second call go unanswered, I heard something else. I have not told anyone this before because the first 3 people I tried to tell reacted in ways that made me understand that this detail in particular would be the detail that moved my account from something uncomfortable but possible to something that would get me a medical evaluation rather than a deposition. I heard the south wall go. I was 60 yards away, at the head of the 2-track, holding both horses. It was not a single impact sound. It was a sustained sound. A deep groan of wood under load, and then a crack, and then a settling, and then quiet. The whole sequence took perhaps 15 seconds. It had the quality of a large tree dropping in heavy wind, that arc of stress to failure to stillness, except there was no wind. The air that morning was perfectly still. I know because I had been standing in it for 30 minutes by then, and I was cold from the stillness of it. I heard Raymond's voice after that, once. I could not hear words. I could hear the register of his voice, which was high, which was not a sound I had ever heard Raymond Pelletier make, not in 2 winters of working alongside him, in conditions that should have broken a lesser man. One sound, high, and then nothing. Sedge pulled against the lead rope hard enough to nearly take it from my hand. Foster had his ears flat, and I did not go back. I want the examiner to write that down exactly. I heard the wall go. I heard Raymond's voice, and I did not go back. I started down the 2-track with the horses and the catch, and I did not go back. I have told myself 100 explanations for that decision. I had no useful weapon for whatever had come through that wall. Going back to the cabin on foot, with a skinning knife against a thing that had just driven through 4 inches of pine, would have produced 2 bodies in the snow instead of 1. Raymond was alive when I heard his voice, which was a reasonable indicator that whatever had happened was survivable, and my returning would have helped him. I have tried that one. I have tried the practical calculation that the most useful thing I could do for Raymond was to get to a telephone and bring help, which is what I did, and which resulted in help arriving 4 days later because of roads and schedules. I have tried them all. None of them cover the full distance. The truth is that I heard the wall go and I heard his voice, and I was afraid. Not the managed fear of a man making a calculated risk assessment. The other kind. The kind that takes your legs in a direction and does not let you think clearly about where they are going. I went down the 2-track because my legs decided to, and my mind followed. And by the time my mind had caught up enough to ask what I was doing, I was too far down the track to turn back without leaving the horses. And I did not leave the horses, and I have had 6 years to think about whether I should have left the horses. Raymond was 29 years old. He had been planning to save enough from the trapping to go back to school, or to start a small guiding business out of Traverse City. He talked about both possibilities with equal enthusiasm, which was one of the things I liked about him, that he had 2 futures in mind and considered it a matter of timing rather than choice. He had a younger sister in Traverse City, Helene, and a mother who is still living there, and I have not been able to bring myself to go to Traverse City since 1937. I want to say something about the piece of wall plank that is in evidence in this proceeding, and then I will answer whatever questions the examiner puts to me. I pried that section of wall free with a draw knife and a splitting wedge on the morning of the 15th, after the deputies and Gordon Stotts had completed their documentation of the site and given me permission to return and remove my equipment. I pried it free because I looked at those 5 parallel gouges, driven clean through 4 inches of pine, and I understood that this was the only evidence I had, that was not a track in snow that would melt. Not a score on an exterior log face that a skeptical man could attribute to a falling branch. Not a verbal description of a sound that a skeptical man could attribute to a coyote or a winter-hungry bear. This piece of wood tells a specific story. It says that something stood on the interior face of the south wall of that cabin, or was coming through from the exterior, and it put 5 points into the wood and drew them across with enough force and penetration to pass through 4 inches of pine. I carried it out on the sled with the last of the catch. I have kept it since in the back room of my house in Manton, wrapped in the same canvas we used to pack the pelts, which is a detail I mention because the canvas still carries the smell of the catch, and sometimes when the weather is changing, I can smell it through the back room door, and I think about that clearing north of the Manton Road, and about Raymond's voice in the cold air, and about the sound of the wall failing under something's weight. The examiner has asked me whether I intend to return to the trap line north of the Manton Road. No. I am leasing the territory to a man from Cadillac who is welcome to it. I have not told him why. The examiner has asked whether I believe the entity, his word, is still in that territory. Yes, I believe it has been in that territory since before August Kroll built that cabin, and since before whoever was there before August Kroll. I believe it will be in that territory after every person in this room is gone. I believe the Depression years brought us north into ground we had not historically worked, because the catch that far north was worth the extra distance when the alternative was nothing, and I believe we were not the first trappers to press that far north into that country and encounter something wrong, and I suspect we will not be the last. The examiner has asked whether I have any other statement to make before the close of this deposition. I have one statement, yes. It is directed to the families of any man working a winter line in the hardwood country north of the Manton Road terminus, or north of similar terrain in the upper-lower peninsula, and it is this. If you run that country in February, and the ground is frozen hard enough that a track pressed into the packed snow holds its shape for days, and you find a 2-point track around your camp in a circuit with a 52-inch stride length, and you find your perimeter stakes pulled clean from frozen ground, and your horses press into the far corner of the lean-to and will not be calmed by any means you know, and at night you hear through your cabin walls a wet, rhythmic sound like a large dog running hard that does not diminish as the hours pass, but only grows closer and does not fade until after midnight and sometimes later. Do not argue about the debt. Do not calculate the cost of the catch you are leaving. Do not waste 4 hours on a disagreement about whether what is outside your walls is something ordinary that will lose interest if you hold your position. Leave. Leave with what you can carry, and leave the rest. Leave before it decides that the wall will not stop it, because when it decides that, it is correct. That is the statement I have for this proceeding. I will answer questions if the examiner has them, but I have nothing further to add voluntarily. I have the wall plank in the bed of my truck. I am prepared to leave it in the custody of this court if the court wants it. If the court does not want it, I am taking it home, and I am keeping it, because it is the only true record of what happened to Raymond Pelletier in February of 1937, and I owe him that much at least. I owe him a true record, even if I cannot put a name on what made it. Even if no one in this building is willing to say out loud what I believe made it. I am done.